Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Alchemist. Tonight, we journey into the creaking wood of an ancient home where silence isn't just golden, it's required. A fire flickers low in a stone hearth. Dust curls through the air like sleepy moths. And somewhere in the dark belly of an alchemist's workshop, a floorboard groans one last time before it gives way. You can practically smell the smoke, the ink, and the oddly sweet tang of crushed belladonna on the air. What lies beneath that broken plank isn't just rot or forgotten tools. It pulses faintly like a breath held too long, and it glows. But only when the room is completely unnervingly silent. Which is, let's face it, an occupational hazard for an alchemist who regularly talks to his plants. You probably want to know this. Silence in this case means no humming, no wind, no scraping robes, no shifting weight, not even the drip of a loose pipette. And yes, that includes the sounds inside your head. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your part of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The alchemist, whose name had long since been lost in the folds of old recipe margins, was sitting cross-legged when it happened. He'd just dropped a pinch too much star anise into a copper cauldron, which hissed like a snake unamused. As he leaned back to sigh, the plank under his bench cracked, not dramatically, not with flair, just one short, dry snap like a twig breaking in your palm. Then a slow collapse, one board after another, giving way in a disjointed spiral pattern. They didn't fall straight down either. They twisted, sloped inward, like something had coiled itself up and pressed from below, waiting for the weight of a single quiet man and his oversteeped tincture to finally give it permission to rise. The floor didn't open to a hole, not exactly. Instead, it revealed what looked like black stone, perfectly round, etched with rings, each more intricate than the last. And at the center, a spiral glowing faintly with a color that doesn't exist in most languages. The alchemist leaned forward, heart kicking his ribs like a mule. He whispered, just a word of awe, and the glow vanished. Every ring of the spiral dulled like a coin left in vinegar. He tried again, this time saying nothing, just staring, breathing quietly through his nose. Still nothing. He held his breath. The spiral bloomed, soft light, not warm but not cold either, stretched across the chamber like fog illuminated from within. No noise, not even the hiss of his cauldron, now crusted with half-coagulated resin. The entire house seemed to pause, like a creature afraid of stepping on its own tail. And there, in the hush that made his eardrums ring with the sound of nothing, the spiral pulsed, once, then stopped. The alchemist remained still. A beetle skittered along the wall, but even it moved like it didn't want to be noticed. When the spiral dimmed again, he tested a whisper, "Why now?" and watched as the glow winked out instantly, like a candle under a bell jar. Historians still argue whether medieval alchemists genuinely believed in the transmutation of matter, or if they were simply the world's earliest chemists with a flair for metaphor. But our alchemist wasn't after gold, not anymore. He'd long since given up the philosopher's stone for quieter obsessions, memory tonics, dream breathers, forget-me-inks, things that lived in the space between what was said and what was felt. So to find a mechanism, a spiral, that reacted to silence rather than ingredients, was like uncovering a relic not just from another age, but from a different way of thinking entirely. He stood carefully, brushing flecks of oak and chalk from his robe. The hole was no wider than a wine barrel, but deep, not empty, just unknowable. He dropped a pebble in, no sound, no bounce, just the absence of return. You may be wondering if he considered calling for help. A neighbor, perhaps? The local cleric? The town's wool merchant who'd once claimed his father was a diviner? No, he didn't even consider it. For one, they'd talk, and second, they'd laugh, and third, they'd ruin everything with their breathing. Instead, he pulled the rug over the hole, wrote "Don't step here" in chalk, and went to bed. The rug glowed faintly from beneath. He didn't sleep. By morning the alchemist had arranged his breakfast. 3 olives, a cube of stale bread, and a weakly steeped tea, as far from the spiral as possible. Not out of fear, well, not exactly. It was more that the silence still lingered, heavy in the beams and window panes. Even the birds had stopped their usual screeching debate about which chimney offered the best nesting insulation. He sat cross-legged, watching the rug with the kind of casual suspicion normally reserved for tax collectors and untested spells. The silence beneath the floorboards wasn't passive. It didn't just exist. It pressed upward, like something listening back. He'd spent the night replaying the moment of the collapse in his head, how the glow responded not to sound itself but to the absence of it. Every experiment he'd ever conducted had involved fire, herbs, metals, chance. But this was a formula written in hush. He crept toward the rug and pulled it back. The spiral greeted him again, dim but steady. Testing a theory, he opened his mouth to say hello, and then clamped it shut before the word escaped. Still glowed. He shifted his foot slightly. Creak. The glow faded. Still not just any noise. His noise. The spiral seemed attuned to his very presence. Downstairs, the rest of the house stirred faintly. A log settled in the hearth with a low thud. The water clock in the kitchen gave its hourly bubble. Yet the spiral remained lit as long as he remained still and silent. This thing wasn't just measuring acoustic energy. It was responding to consciousness. Modern acoustic physics would later define true silence as an environment where sound pressure levels fall below the threshold of human hearing, around 0 decibels. But the alchemist didn't know this. He just knew that whatever was under his house had rules, and those rules didn't care about science. They cared about stillness, presence, maybe even obedience. He fetched a feather from his notes drawer, plucked from a mute raven he'd briefly owned before it inexplicably combusted during a botched echolocation potion. Holding it in one hand, he extended it into the hole. Nothing, no glow change. He let it fall. Again, no return sound, not even a faint rustle. The feather simply vanished into the depth. He fetched his mirror next, a bronze disc barely reflective enough to shave by. Angling it, he tried to catch a reflection of the spiral's center. No luck. The deeper he angled, the darker the spiral appeared. There was no light source down there, no opening, no flame, yet it glowed as if lit from within by thought. He scratched his beard, a movement that immediately dulled the glow. Damn, even skin on skin was too loud. He grabbed a strip of wool and tied his hands inside it like a monk preparing for penance. Thus began his first proper test. He sat beside the spiral, heart slowing. He inhaled through his nose, exhaled without force. Time stretched. Minutes, then an hour. His stomach growled once. The glow dimmed sharply. He grimaced and vowed never again to eat olives, before silent meditation. Eventually, after considerable restraint and the complete numbing of both legs, the glow did more than pulse. It shifted. A thin third ring appeared around the center, inscribed with markings he didn't recognize. Not Latin, not Hermetic, not even those weird scribbles from the Cave of Light he'd once traded a molar to visit. These were symbols that looked like if sound could write its own name. Quirky historical footnote: in 13th century Prague, a monk named Aaron Sillet claimed he could translate dreams into a silent musical language, using colored powders and owl feathers. He was promptly exiled for turning the local bishop's sermon into a mimed interpretive dance. But the alchemist now wondered, had that monk seen a spiral like this? As he leaned forward, careful not to let his robe brush the planks, a strange thing happened. The spiral brightened and a warmth, not hot, not cold, just felt, rose toward his face like a silent exhale. His nose tickled. No, not now, please, not, he sneezed. The spiral vanished instantly, and with it, the new ring. He groaned, half in frustration, half because his entire foot had gone to sleep. He had gotten so close, but the lesson was clear. Sound, even involuntary sound, was banishment. Historians still argue whether alchemists practiced more science or magic, or whether the two were ever truly separate to begin with. Our alchemist had always straddled both. He didn't care whether the spiral was built by druids or aliens or proto-physicists with a flair for masonry. All he knew now was that silence was a key, and somewhere, beyond that coiled staircase of light, a lock was waiting. That night, he ate nothing, drank nothing, removed every squeaky hinge, stifled every breeze, padded every corner of his home in velvet and old tapestries. He even whispered calming nothings to the mice in the wall, begging them for just one night of stillness. And then he sat again, beside the spiral, silent, still, listening for something he couldn't yet name. By the fourth hour of silence, the alchemist had begun hearing things. Ironic, given the whole objective, not real sounds, phantom ones. A kettle that wasn't boiling, footsteps that didn't exist, the imagined echo of someone calling his name from down the street. Someone who'd died last year, probably. He kept his breathing even. He'd tied a silk band around his chest to limit movement. His eyes were sore from staring too long, but the spiral, oh, the spiral had rewarded him. It now revealed 5 concentric rings, not just glowing but slowly rotating, like gears that powered no machine yet churned with meaning. Between the second and third rings, small points of light blinked like fireflies, and still, no sound. Even his thoughts felt hushed. He tried not to wonder if this was enlightenment or hypoxia. The alchemist carefully stood, his knees popped, but even that soft click caused the lights to dim momentarily. The floorboards around the spiral were older than his workshop, maybe older than the town itself. They weren't cut with iron or copper tools. Their marks were smooth, aged by something else. Time, pressure, heat. He leaned in closer. He noticed something new along the edges of the floorboards that hadn't broken, tiny etchings, almost imperceptible unless viewed at a certain angle. They weren't random nicks or damage. They were letters. He ran a finger across one, tracing a curve that looked like a backward S with 3 diagonal slashes. Again, no known language, but something about them felt rhythmic, musical even, as though the boards themselves had once carried song. Here's a historical fun bite. In medieval Islamic architecture, a few scholars documented singing stones, slabs used in palaces that produce specific tones when walked upon in silence. They say it helped the caliphs detect intruders. Most historians think it's just poetic exaggeration, but the alchemist couldn't help but wonder if this was related. If this whole structure beneath his house was meant to react to sound, not as noise, but as a trespass. He fetched a thin brush, dipped it in a tincture made from ash root and moonlit vine sap, yes, collected only on new moons, don't ask, and began gently tracing the symbols on the floor. As he did, the spiral below pulsed brighter with every finished letter, like a system acknowledging a password being typed slowly, carefully. When he finished the third letter, the spiral stopped rotating. For a moment he feared he'd broken it. Then came the rumble, not from below but through the boards. A vibration so subtle it didn't shake the house. It resonated with it. The shelves trembled slightly, glass flasks hummed softly and briefly lit up like birthday lanterns, and the spiral's innermost ring sank by a fraction, clicking into a recess with a soft, weightless sha. He held his breath, not out of necessity this time, but reverence. Historians still argue whether certain sacred buildings, like the Temple of Delphi or the oracle chambers in Crete, were designed with intentional acoustic illusions, whispers traveling through walls, voices amplified by specific curves of stone. The alchemist didn't need architecture texts to understand his house, or what lay beneath it, was one of those places. He placed both palms on the spiral now, not flat, just fingers brushing the stone. It was cool, not cold. It felt like memory. He whispered a word in his head, not daring to say it aloud. Home. Then, like a dream sketched on parchment, the spiral responded, not with light, but with scent, a faint odor of scorched parchment, dust and rose oil, and beneath it, earth, not the sweet soil of gardens, but ancient earth, arid, calcified, deep. He gasped quietly, forgetting himself. The spiral dimmed. Again, silence. Again, the slow return of glow. He sat back. He needed answers. The floorboards weren't just breaking, revealing. The spiral had likely always been there, long before he'd ever hung his herbal charts, or spilled his powdered camphor. Maybe long before this building was ever meant to be a house. The alchemist thought back to what little he knew about the land this town had been built upon, before the empire, before the church. The first settlers were described in local tavern legends as the builders without nails. They used stone, silence, and symbols. Most dismissed it as bar gossip. Same crowd who claimed chickens could predict the weather and that drinking morning dew ensured fertility. But maybe, just maybe, the builders were real. In a chest beneath his bed, the alchemist dug out a folded, brittle sheepskin map. It depicted the old town before it was a town, just clusters of trade posts and goat paths, and in the center, a circle, not labeled, not explained, just marked. Guess where his house now sat? Some things don't happen by coincidence. Some people don't live where they do by chance. As he stared at the glowing spiral again, he thought perhaps he hadn't found it at all. Perhaps it had been waiting. The alchemist, ever one to chase a hunch into a wall and then knock politely until it opened, turned next to one of the few half-finished spells he'd never dared complete, the ink of audial negation. A mouthful, yes, but essentially it was ink brewed to absorb sound, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. He'd begun designing it 2 years prior, after an unfortunate incident involving a gossiping scroll and a particularly vengeful local librarian. The ink had been shelved, partly because the ingredients were rare, and partly because the side effects were unpredictable. But now, with a spiral that responded only to the absence of sound, and rewarded that absence with knowledge, he had new motivation. The recipe was etched into a slice of bark from the weeping birch, a tree rumoured to only grow in graveyards where no one had cried. Nonsense, of course. His own sample came from a sapling growing beside a very weepy blacksmith's family tomb. Still, the bark had retained the formula well. He gathered what he had: powdered void root, which doesn't grow so much as vanish into existence, dried tongueflower petals, and a thimble of soundless salt, harvested from a cave where even bats refused to echolocate. With these, he began the careful process of mixing, grinding, binding. A mainstream historical note here: while many assume inks of the medieval period were simple carbon-based mixtures, a surprising number were alchemical in nature, containing arsenic, mercury, and even powdered lapis lazuli, for those who could afford the whisper of a saint's robe in color. Our alchemist had dabbled in all of them. But this ink? This one refused to reflect light. It shimmered, sure, but like heat on cobblestone or breath on cold glass. And as he stirred, something else happened. The sounds in the room began to dull, not vanish, just mute. The bubbling of his neighboring brew reduced to a muffled pop. The distant clack of his water clock ticked slower, heavier, as if submerged. Even his own heartbeat, usually the drum by which his rituals marched, became a whisper behind bone. Encouraged, he dipped a quill, blunt, carved from a buzzard's feather, and wrote a single character on parchment: silence. Not just in the room, in his mind. The spiral responded instantly. A jolt of light surged upward from the hole, brushing the air like a ripple in silk. The etched rings rotated again, faster this time. New patterns emerged, briefly glowing, then fading like ink disappearing under moonlight. It worked. Feeling bold and a little drunk on the thrill of discovery, he turned to his cat, Ethel, who had been sitting on a windowsill with the indignant patience of one who knows you've forgotten dinner. He tapped her gently and held up the ink-drawn parchment. She meowed, or tried to. Nothing came out. The cat jumped, looked personally offended, and bolted into the next room. The alchemist blinked. He touched the parchment, still warm, still glowing faintly at the edges. It didn't just silence the air around it. It absorbed sound aimed at it, like a void, or a sponge for noise. This, of course, raised ethical concerns. Temporarily muting a cat, arguably forgivable. But what if he touched it to a person? A bell? A memory? Fringe alchemical theories from the 14th century proposed that sound, particularly the spoken word, left behind echoes in physical space. They called them voice ghosts, not spirits in the afterlife sense, but in the residue of sound sense. Some claimed entire conversations could be reheard from clay pots or glass bottles if turned just right. Most dismissed this as foolishness. But then again, most had never watched a cat fail to meow. Historians still argue whether such sound-preserving theories prefigured modern phonograph technology, or were simply wishful thinking. The alchemist didn't care. He had proof, a glowing spiral that rewarded silence and an ink that could manufacture it. He dipped the quill again, and drew a wide circle around the spiral's edge. As the ink touched the floorboards, they ceased creaking. The light from the spiral didn't just glow, it brightened, layered like a sunrise coming through frost. He removed his boots. He lay down on his side, cheek nearly to the spiral, and watched. And in the shimmering hush, he saw movement, not a creature, not a ghost, but a shape within the spiral, a kind of shadow that twisted like smoke but obeyed the geometry of the rings. It moved only when he didn't think about it, when his mind went still, when even his intent was silent. Then he blinked. The shape vanished. The glow returned to normal. The rings slowed again. He lay there for a long while, staring, no longer thinking of silence as absence, but as invitation. Ethel returned eventually and sat on his back, her tail flicking with practiced judgment. She still couldn't meow, but she purred, a soft rumble he didn't know if the spiral could tolerate. But it didn't dim. Maybe purring didn't count. Maybe contentment was a kind of silence too. The silence had become a second skin. The alchemist now moved through his home like a ghost, sock-footed, breath shallow, avoiding even the brush of parchment or the rustle of his robes. It wasn't just about respect anymore, it was necessity. The spiral had begun showing him glimpses of something, patterns, symbols, light moving in shapes he couldn't quite name. Each visit offered a flicker more, but only if he earned it. Still, he'd hit a wall. The spiral reacted. But what was it? What was this thing beneath his floor? It was time to dig deeper, not literally, at least not yet. He needed records, histories, maps older than the crumbling one under his bed, which meant the librarium. You'd expect the city's librarium to be grand. It wasn't. It was a squat, sun-starved structure stitched together from retired abbey stones and leftover bricks from an abandoned bathhouse. Even its nameplate was a reused gravestone turned backwards. The alchemist had a complicated relationship with the place. He loved knowledge. He hated the cranky archivist who insisted he wear gloves. Still, he presented his credentials, a wax-sealed letter and a jar of pickled mice for the librarian's owl, and descended into the restricted vaults. These were the scrolls no one asked about, forgotten manuals, banned religious texts, old family records that had somehow made it into the archive through inheritance disputes, likely involving poisoned porridge. In the third aisle, under a stack of mildew-flecked atlases, he found a roll labeled Alchemical Infrastructures of Pre-Imperial Settlements, not exactly best-selling material. He took it to a cracked reading desk. The script was archaic, less Latin, more scribble with ego, but legible enough. He read about spiral foundations, used by a civilization referred to only as the Quiet Order. The scroll claimed these spirals weren't just for decoration, they were structural resonance matrices. Fancy phrase for something that made buildings more stable, if no one spoke. Apparently some believed silence itself carried frequency, that unspoken thought had weight, that words when uttered aloud changed the fabric of reality. Too many voices in one place, and the spirals would collapse, unravel, or worse, awaken. Quirky footnote here. A fringe belief during the reign of Queen Eglantine held that speaking aloud near the royal crypt could cause the spirits to vibrate free from their embalmed flesh. Guards were instructed to hum at all times to prevent this. The alchemist had always scoffed at the idea, until now. He turned the scroll. Near the end, a diagram, a spiral with 10 rings. His own had shown only 5. Beneath the image, a note, handwritten and much newer than the rest. Only in silence may the 11th be drawn. He frowned. There were only 10 rings in the image. Was the 11th hidden or forbidden? Historians still argue whether the Quiet Order was real or a metaphor for monastic builders too shy to take credit. But the alchemist had seen the spiral. He'd felt it shift beneath his fingers. He'd watched it respond to ink and breath, and the inner hush of a still mind. This wasn't metaphor, it was machinery. He borrowed the scroll, technically stole it, though he left a beat coin as a rental, wrapped it tight, and hurried home. When he returned, Ethel sat atop the covered spiral, tail flicking with pointed nonchalance. She could meow again, though she hadn't since the ink incident. He knelt, unrolled the scroll, and compared the diagrams. They matched exactly, except one thing. His spiral had something the diagram didn't. Tiny marks between rings 6 and 7, almost invisible unless you stared long enough. Not symbols, hinges. They formed a seam, like something was meant to open. His heart quickened. He realized that the spiral, as elaborate as it already was, might be just a lid, a hatch, a doorway. The alchemist whispered nothing, and the spiral glowed. The next morning began with an itch behind the alchemist's eyes, one that couldn't be scratched with fingers or tea or even 3 satisfying sneezes in a row. It was the kind of itch that only answers could relieve. The spiral, it seemed, wasn't just a device or a symbol, it was a lock, a sealed thing. And if the scroll from the librarian was to be trusted, which was always a gamble, then unlocking it might mean venturing deeper into knowledge best left in whispers. He brewed a focus tonic, 1 part clarity root, 1 part pickled honeybee brain, and a drizzle of squid ink aged in starlight. It tasted like betrayal and licorice, but it worked. By midday, his mind was sharp enough to remember dreams he hadn't yet had. With steady hands and silent steps, he returned to the spiral. He brought with him an old relic from his youth, a carved bone tablet, gifted to him by a trader who'd once crossed the forgotten peninsula barefoot and half-mad. The tablet had always unnerved him, not because of its texture, though it did feel uncomfortably like licking a clean tooth, but because it was etched with the same kind of non-language as the spiral's rings. At the time, he'd assumed it was just proto-alchemical gibberish, decorative, but now the match was unmistakable. He placed the tablet near the spiral and waited. The glow changed, not brighter, just deeper. It turned from cool silver to something closer to dusk, violet-tinted, with veins of soft green curling through it, like veins in marble. The inner ring began to rotate again, but this time it didn't stop. It clicked, then turned again, then clicked. Something beneath it moved. He held his breath. A hiss of stale air rose from the spiral's core, and then, for the first time, it opened. Not fully, just a slit at the center, no wider than a candle wick, but through that slit, a shape glimmered, metallic, curved, and too precise to be natural. Machinery, or something close. The alchemist stared, pulse steady now, the tonic working its magic. He dropped a thread of sound ink into the slit. The glow dimmed instantly, but the slit remained open. He placed the bone tablet over the opening and pressed gently. Nothing happened. Then, quietly, like a sigh made by stone, the spiral closed again. The bone tablet melted into its surface, not with heat or acid, but like a bead of mercury being absorbed. The floor was once again smooth, but now ring 6 had changed. A symbol had appeared, and he recognized it. The alchemical sigil for sacrifice. Fringe theories in alchemy had long debated whether ancient symbols like sacrifice were ever meant to be literal. Some argued it referred to giving up wealth or knowledge. Others insisted blood was involved. Then there were the truly out-there theorists who believed sacrifice meant the surrender of voice, memory, or time. Our alchemist was open to possibilities. Except blood, he didn't like mess. He stood, deep in thought, and bumped a hanging bundle of dried herbs. A single sprig of something dead and purple dropped onto the spiral. It vanished before it landed. The spiral glowed, just for a moment, brighter than before. So, organic matter could be offered. He fetched a dried mushroom, the kind that grew only in graveyard moss, dropped it, gone. Another pulse of glow, not stronger but clearer, less hazy. The spiral wasn't just reacting to offerings, it was learning from them. Historians still argue whether the great alchemist Alisar was executed for treason or disappeared into a self-built machine called the thought spiral. Some say the spiral was a metaphor, others say it was real, and that he left behind devices buried in forgotten places, meant to store something greater than gold, memory itself. Was this such a spiral? He dared a final test for the day, a cut from his own beard. He hated parting with it, and a drop of dream milk from a glass vial, labeled in case of final hypothesis. Both disappeared, and in the glow that followed, he didn't see light or symbols or new rings. He saw images, flickering like oil on water, scenes not his own, an endless hallway, a chamber of statues, and most hauntingly, a stairwell winding downward into absolute black. Whatever lay below the spiral wasn't just ancient, it was watching. The spiral pulsed quietly that night as the alchemist sat beside it, legs folded beneath him, hands open on his knees. He had abandoned scrolls, closed his jars, darkened every lantern but one. This time, no ink, no bones, no breath louder than the tick of thought. He had begun to suspect that it wasn't silence in the room that the spiral craved, it was silence in him. So, he did something few alchemists ever dared. He tried to empty his mind. This, of course, was absurd. Even monks with decades of candlelit practice struggled to do it. And yet, he attempted it anyway. Thought after thought, he let them drift by like clouds he refused to name. The grocery list, the memory of a girl from a summer long gone, the itch in his knee, the mold on the pear in the kitchen, gone. Let them float, let them pass. And when the last thought slipped free, like a bubble rising unnoticed, the spiral responded. A shimmer of light burst not from the rings but between them. The air thickened. Warmth rose from the spiral like a breath exhaled by the floor itself, but no heat, just awareness, presence. He could feel it against his skin, not touching but noticing him. Then, without warning, the light coalesced into shapes. Symbols, yes, but moving, drifting above the spiral like fireflies made of glyphs. Each one formed and then faded as if written on breath. He dared not move. His eyes widened. They weren't random, they were sequential, a language, not of words or sound, but of stillness. Each shape coincided with his state of mind. When he flinched, one vanished. When he returned to calm, another emerged. It was learning his rhythm, his breath, his mind's tempo. Here's a fascinating historical quirk. A 14th century Persian mathematician once theorized that geometry and mood were linked, claiming that emotional states could be plotted on spirals, anger near the edge, joy near the center, sorrow somewhere just beyond reach. Everyone mocked him, but looking at the shifting glyphs above his spiral, the alchemist began to wonder if that madman had been onto something. The spiral wasn't measuring sound, it was measuring emotionless clarity, a silence so deep it echoed only one thing, the self stripped of clutter, and with every breathless moment, the glyphs grew more defined. He saw a triangle twist into a sigil of balance, a crescent curve dissolve into a key. One shape blinked briefly like an eye, then split, birthing another glyph entirely. Historians still argue whether certain pre-imperial symbols were letters, musical notes, or representations of celestial bodies. These symbols, they were none of those, they were instructions, each one a response to his inner state. The alchemist began sketching in the air, not with his fingers but with focus. Where his attention flowed, so did the glyphs. When he panicked, thinking about how wild this was, it all vanished. He started again, calm, still, empty. The spiral shimmered, and this time, the inner ring didn't just rotate, it descended, sinking half an inch with a soft, stone-scraping click. A new recess opened, tiny, hexagonal. At its center, a depression shaped not like a keyhole but like a spiral's shadow. He recognized it. Back in his archive of forgotten tools and gifted trinkets was a pendant, spiral-shaped, carved from dark obsidian, passed to him by a nomadic trader who spoke only in riddles. He had worn it once, but it always made his chest feel heavy. He tucked it away, forgot about it, until now. He rose slowly and retrieved it. Back at the spiral, he held it above the new recess. The glow intensified. The pendant felt warm in his palm, pulsing like a second heartbeat. He placed it into the slot. Nothing happened. He frowned, then blinked. Everything went dark. Not black, not blindness, just dark. As if all the light had folded in on itself. He was still in his workshop, but the spiral was no longer glowing, and yet he could see it, outlined not by light, but by absence of it. A negative shape in the world. The pendant vanished, and then he heard it. Not a sound, not a voice, a thought, not his own. You are not alone. He gasped, and just as quickly clamped a hand over his mouth. The spiral didn't fade this time, but it pulsed, slowly, like it approved. He sat back, mind racing, but body still. That voice, no, that presence, had spoken not through ears, but through quiet, through the space where sound might have been. It had waited for him to still his thoughts, his noise, his being, and now it was awake. The alchemist barely slept, not out of fear, well, maybe a little fear, but because the silence had changed. It no longer felt like absence. It hummed, in a way he couldn't explain, a kind of pressure in the air, like the room held its breath even when he didn't. By dawn, he began testing the spiral's response to sound again. He needed to understand its thresholds. He tapped once, barely a flick of a knuckle against the wooden frame. The spiral dimmed. He let the room settle. Light returned. Then he tried something more curious. He whispered inside his head, not out loud, just a word. Hello. The spiral flickered, not dimmed, flickered. That wasn't possible, was it? Could it sense internal sound? Historians still argue whether the concept of inner voice was recognized as something real in pre-modern Europe. Most agree it wasn't. Thought was thought, prayer was prayer, talking to yourself, a one-way ticket to being locked up with the monastery's wine goat. But this spiral, it had responded. He needed a new test. He retrieved a small copper rod from a drawer, one he'd enchanted years ago to store echoes, a joke gift. Originally, it could capture up to 10 seconds of any sound and release it later, like a poor man's bard, usually used for preserving arguments or repeating "don't forget the potatoes" over and over again. He held it above the spiral and activated the release. The rod crackled and whispered, "Try not to make everything explode this time." His own voice. Familiar, too familiar. The spiral reacted violently. The glow died. The light vanished not in retreat, but recoil. The copper rod split down the center like butter left too long in the sun. A faint burn mark appeared on the floor, just enough to say, "Never again." The alchemist staggered back, nearly knocking over a stand of dried fox tongue. The spiral did not recover. Not for hours. That's when he decided to start recording the strange behavior properly. He pulled out his unruly events journal, usually reserved for ghosts in the pantry or inexplicable dreams about upside-down castles, and began to map the spiral's moods, glows, reactions. But something caught his eye in the margins. It wasn't his handwriting. He froze. There, scribbled beside a previous note about a failed silent spell, were 3 unfamiliar lines, written in a smooth, slow hand. Not his, not a friend. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the discipline of presence. You are heard. He stared at it, heart slamming against his ribs. He flipped the page. Another note. Don't speak aloud when it answers. That night, he set a trap. A simple one. He prepared his bedroll, lit a single blue wax candle, and placed a sheet of parchment across the spiral, just thick enough to take ink. He lay on his side, barely breathing, and waited. Hours passed. The candle guttered low. Then he woke, though he wasn't sure he'd truly fallen asleep. The parchment had changed. On it, etched faintly in what looked like dried dew, were marks. Circular, fluid, a kind of writing he didn't recognize, but not drawn with ink. Impressed, as if the words had risen up from the spiral, not pressed down onto it. He placed his ear near the spiral. No sound, but his mind buzzed. So he left the parchment in place, every night for a week. Each morning, new markings. Sometimes just shapes, sometimes almost maps. Once, what appeared to be a face, a crude drawing of eyes and a mouth, open but not speaking. Then, on the 7th morning, the whispers began, not heard through the air, but inside the walls. He stood still in the early half-light, staring at the boards. Behind them something murmured, not words, more like distant chanting, not male, not female, just voices, soft and low, like someone praying underwater. The spiral glowed faintly, as if aware that it had been caught mid-sentence. The alchemist approached, carefully. The walls were unchanged. He tapped. No echo, no vibration, but the voices shifted slightly, like dancers noticing a new spectator. He realized, quite suddenly, that they weren't behind the walls. They were beneath the floor, more precisely, beneath the spiral, whispers, coiling upward like smoke, looping phrases just below meaning. In one sudden and completely unwelcome moment, he wondered, had anyone else ever lived in this house before him? Was the spiral reacting to him alone, or remembering others? He reached for his notebook again. On the newest page, an additional line had appeared. They never learnt to stop listening. A chill ran through him. Somewhere far below, the whispers continued, not growing louder, just clearer, and more than anything, they sounded like they were trying to be quiet. The alchemist spent the morning exploring a paradox. How does one hear a whisper that is only meant to be felt? The voices from beneath the spiral weren't sounds in the ordinary sense. They seemed to bypass his ears entirely, settling into the marrow of his bones, like the memory of music rather than music itself. It unnerved him. Not because they were frightening, though they were, but because they wanted something. He could feel the intent coiled into every voiceless syllable. So he returned to one of his earliest theories, that the spiral demanded sacrifice. But what kind? He wasn't about to offer blood. Not yet. And he'd already given beard, mushrooms, and fragments of dream. But what if sacrifice meant something subtler, something stranger? That's when he remembered the widow's tongue. It was a plant, of course. No relation to actual widows. It grew only in the shadow of gallows, feeding off the remorse that seeped into the soil. Botanists called it Mutaphyllum hushii, but to apothecaries and the few reckless alchemists who'd ever used it, it was simply known as the herb that silenced. One petal on the tongue, and your vocal cords went dormant for hours. No pain, no harm, just silence. Real, internal silence. He'd only ever used it once, and only as a joke on a former apprentice who refused to stop humming. Now, he retrieved the dried bundle from his vault, blew off a layer of thyme, and placed a single purple petal on his tongue. The effect was immediate. Not just muteness, but something deeper. Even thoughts felt muffled, as if the herb dulled not only the voice, but the echo chamber of the mind. He walked back to the spiral slowly, unsure if his own footsteps were even real, and this time, the spiral welcomed him, not with symbols or light, but with movement. The center ring shifted again, descending further, revealing a second recessed ring below the first, etched with symbols unlike any he had seen before. These weren't abstract. These looked like tools, shapes that resembled hinges, locks, mechanisms, a machine, or perhaps a keyhole with no key. He sat, resisting the urge to whisper even in his head, and the whispers beneath the floorboards grew clearer. Not louder, just more specific. One voice in particular curled around the edges of his perception, feminine in shape but not in tone, saying, though never aloud, you are closer than they were. He wasn't sure who they were. He didn't want to know. Just then, Ethel trotted into the room, tail high, a smug expression on her face that said, I've just knocked something expensive off a shelf. She leapt onto the table beside the spiral and blinked at him. She meowed. Nothing happened. But then she purred, and the spiral reacted. It pulsed, not just with light, but with warmth. A gentle wave of pressure passed over the alchemist's skin, like the moment just before a storm breaks, or the hush when a song ends. He stared at the cat, dumbfounded. Historians still argue whether animals can sense energies that humans cannot. Dogs and earthquakes, birds and death, cats and, well, everything. Fringe writings from obscure bestiaries once claimed that certain feline breeds could locate spirit seams, thin places where worlds brushed against each other. He had always rolled his eyes at those stories. Now he wasn't so sure. He placed his hand gently on the spiral. The warmth increased, and from beneath the boards the voice returned. The others were louder. He blinked. Others. He opened his journal, and though his vocal cords were still stilled by the widow's tongue, he wrote quickly, How many before me? Nothing. Then, beneath the ink, a response bloomed, not written, but revealed, as if the paper had always carried the answer, and only now chose to show it. 4. He shivered. Ethel flicked her tail and trotted off again, bored of mysteries. 4 before him. 4 who had found the spiral. Had they also been drawn in by the quiet? Had they made it further? Or had they been claimed by the thing now whispering through the seams of the wood? He glanced toward the scroll from the librarium, the one that mentioned the quiet order, 4, a sacred number in many traditions. The cardinal directions, the elements, the humors, the seasons. He didn't believe in coincidence. Not anymore. The spiral wasn't just a key, it was a test, and each ring was a door, or a memory, or a layer of something no longer alive, but not quite dead. He sat beside it, breath soft, voice still absent, and waited. And beneath the silence, the whispers, those woven, ancient murmurs, curled into a single clear thought. Only those who give up their name may enter. Names are a strange sort of magic. The alchemist had always believed that. Not just in the way one might label a jar or curse someone from across a tavern, but in the deep, binding way. A name, truly spoken, wasn't just a word. It was an anchor. It held you to your body, to your story, to your past. So, when the spiral whispered, "No," impressed its command upon his thoughts, he felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with age or illness. Only those who give up their name may enter. He hadn't spoken his name aloud in years, not for any magical reason really, more because it had become unnecessary. The townsfolk knew him as the alchemist. His trade permits were written in borrowed Latin. Even his mail, when he received any, was simply addressed to house with the chimney that smokes at odd hours. But still, the name was his, and the idea of surrendering it, of willingly unbinding that final thread of identity, tasted sharp, like biting foil. He sat with the thought a while. Ethel returned, possibly sensing his inner monologue and determined to sabotage it with purring. Then he remembered the mute clockmaker. A year ago, a man had arrived in town with gears instead of words. Couldn't speak, didn't try. Communicated with hand signs and carefully wound machines that clicked and spun with elegant precision. The alchemist had once asked him, jokingly, if he'd ever considered building a device to store silence. The clockmaker didn't laugh. He simply nodded, tapped his chest and sketched a rough design on a napkin. A box filled with gears, each muffled in wool, all turning toward a central spiral. He had named it the Thought Cage. At the time, it was nonsense. Now, not so much. He visited the man that afternoon. The workshop was, predictably, quiet, not empty, just full of motion with no sound. Cogs clicked inside, sealed glass domes, sand flowed between copper tubes. The entire place smelled of machine oil and polished brass. The clockmaker was there, working silently on a device that resembled a music box, except it had no keys or holes. The alchemist signed as best he could, hand to heart, then a slow swirl in the air. "I need silence preserved." The clockmaker studied him for a long moment. Then he pointed to the alchemist's throat, raised an eyebrow. The alchemist nodded, still mute from the widow's tongue, still bound to the spiral's terms. The man stood, crossed to a shelf, and pulled down a small tin box, square, matte black, with no seams visible. He handed it over. On the lid, one word, etched in the finest lettering imaginable: forget. Historians still argue whether silence was ever used as currency. In ancient Buddhist monasteries, some accounts suggest monks could trade months of silence for the right to access restricted teachings. In esoteric Christian sects, there were rites of binding, where silence itself was the vow. But a machine that captured silence? That was something else entirely. The alchemist bowed, took the box, returned home. He spent that evening in preparation, removed every mirror from the house, hid every document with his signature, unhooked the placard that hung on his door. He opened the box. There was no sound, not even air moving. And in that moment something lifted from his chest. Not pressure, but identity. A thread pulled loose. He couldn't remember his name. He knew he had one, could picture the shape of it, could see the syllables dancing like shadows on a wall. But when he tried to think it, really think it, nothing came. He walked, unsteady, to the spiral. It pulsed, then opened. A slit, then a seam, then a full rotation of the sixth ring, revealing the next recess. A spiral staircase descending into darkness. No dramatic flair, no fanfare, just an invitation. He stood at the edge, hands trembling, heart echoing like a question down an empty hall, and then the whisper came again. This time, not from the floorboards, but from within the stairwell. Now you may be known by silence alone. He stepped forward. The wood didn't creak. The spiral didn't fade. Only the scent changed away from dust and rosemary into something cooler, older, stone and metal, secrets sealed in breathless rock. He looked back once. Ethel sat at the edge of the spiral, tail curled around her paws. She blinked slowly, and for a brief, terrible moment, he imagined she said goodbye. But of course, she was just a cat, and he was just a man with no name, following a spiral into silence. The first step creaked, just slightly, not from age, but in protest, as if the spiral staircase itself were testing him, measuring not his weight, but his willingness. The alchemist, nameless now, memory softened like parchment left in the rain, paused, listened, nothing but the soft rhythm of his breath, and the ever-present quiet that somehow still hummed beneath it all. The spiral had shifted fully open, revealing a staircase that twisted downward in a perfect coil. It wasn't made of wood or stone, but something darker. Metal, perhaps, but not the kind you could smelt or polish. This looked like hardened shadow, etched with faint glimmers of silver. The steps didn't echo. His footfalls left no sound. The silence wasn't merely maintained, it was enforced. With each turn of the stair, the light above dimmed, as if the world he'd left behind was not just distant but disinterested. After 20 steps, the air cooled. After 50, the temperature steadied, and the walls began to curve outward, suggesting an opening. Then, without warning, the staircase ended, and the floor beneath him flattened into a landing made of smooth obsidian. The chamber before him was round, vast. The ceiling stretched beyond sight, or maybe it wasn't a ceiling at all, but a void that refused description, and in the center stood the spiral's heart, a domed structure, ribbed like the inner shell of a sea creature, pulsing faintly with the same ghost light he'd seen above. No door, no hinges, just a single seam running along the middle. Above it floated a thin ring of metallic light, unmoving, silent, and surrounding it. Figures, statues, 12 of them, arranged in a circle, each facing away from the dome. All were robed, hands clasped or raised or folded in varying gestures of reverence. Their mouths were open, not in frozen screams or solemn prayers, but in song, yet no sound filled the chamber. The alchemist stepped closer. The silence deepened. He couldn't even hear his heartbeat now. A strange pressure began to build in his chest, like diving too deep underwater. He examined the statues. Each bore different symbols on its robe, runes, spirals, even musical staves carved into their backs. One had a bell hanging from its sleeve, another a scroll curled into petrified parchment. All of them had different features, male, female, neither, but all shared the same blank, listening expression, and all faced away from the spiral dome. He turned slowly, looking for clues, or perhaps warnings. Historians still argue whether ancient singing cults like the Brethren of Bone Harbor ever existed. Some say they performed silent choirs, rituals where participants mimed harmony to awaken celestial machines. Others say the idea is nonsense, the invention of feverish monks, but standing here, the alchemist felt it. This chamber expected music. It just wouldn't allow any. He approached the spiral dome, hands still, breath slow. The floor rippled faintly with each step, as though the stone itself responded to motion. When he reached the dome, he laid one palm upon its surface. No warmth, no chill, just knowing, a sense of being observed, not by eyes, but by the shape of the silence itself. He pressed gently. The seam trembled, and then he heard it, not aloud, but in the memory of sound. A bell, distant, single note, fading before it ever fully rang. Inside the dome, something stirred. He tried to back away, but the floor resisted. Not physically, no force held him, but his feet felt wrong turning away, like walking out mid-sentence. So he remained, palm on the dome. Light spiraled across its surface, thin as thread, winding in patterns that looked familiar. Then he realized they mimicked brain waves, not literally perhaps, but the shapes were unmistakable. Scene curves, frequency arcs, thought rendered in movement. The dome pulsed once more, then, at last, it opened. Not all the way, just a slit, enough to emit a whisper, not in voice, but in sensation. A memory flooded him, his mother or someone like her, humming in the garden, a sound he hadn't remembered in decades. Then it shifted to a time he'd held a vial of breathless vapor too long and nearly collapsed laughing. Then another memory, pain, when he had failed to save a sick boy's father with an expired remedy. They came in flashes, unspoken, unclaimed. "We are the archive," said the spiral without words. He fell to one knee, not in worship, but in awe. The dome wasn't just a container, it was alive. Or perhaps aware. It held memories, not just his, but those of others. Hundreds, thousands. The nameless four who had come before him. Their silence, their thoughts, their emotions unspoken but recorded in perfect stillness. And at the center of it all was that same floating ring of metallic light, still unmoving. He reached for it, and as his fingers neared, a thought bloomed behind his eyes. Only in stillness may the voice be known, and above him, far away, the moon began to shift. The spiral chamber did not breathe, yet somehow, the alchemist felt its rhythm, a subtle pulse beneath his skin, like an invisible tide pulling thought and presence inward. He stood before the floating metallic ring, still suspended in silence, hovering above the dome's split shell. It hadn't moved, not once, and yet it radiated the undeniable impression of waiting. He dared not touch it, not yet. Instead, he walked the perimeter again, studying the 12 statues with renewed scrutiny. They were not identical, though their robes were cut from the same seamless stone. Each one bore unique posture, detail, and most telling, different ears. One had exaggerated, curled ears like a bat. Another, ears like seashell spirals. A third had no ears at all, just smooth skin where they should have been. It dawned on him, these weren't singers, they were listeners. Each sculpted form represented a way of receiving sound, not making it. A chorus, perhaps, yes, but one that sang only through the act of absorbing. And between each pair of statues lay carvings in the floor, spirals again, smaller, each with a different pattern at the center. 12 spirals, 12 listeners, 12 keys. He didn't know, but the ring above the dome did. He stepped back into the center, eyes closed, thoughts stilled, not silent. He had learned by now that the spiral didn't want nothing. It wanted clarity, quiet, not of emptiness, but of purpose. So he breathed, slow and even, and allowed his mind to settle, and the ring moved, just slightly. A quarter turn clockwise like a dial, acknowledging its user. Then it hovered lower, aligning perfectly with his chest, not his hands, not his eyes, his heart. And in that moment, a strange, exhilarating clarity washed over him. Not a memory this time, but a vision. He was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a vast stone hall beneath a different spiral, one not carved but living, twisting like a living root system across the ceiling, glowing with pure thought. Around him, figures in robes moved in complete silence, communicating only with touch, breath, and gaze. He saw them kneeling before a spiral like his, hands placed not in prayer, but in offering. They gave away words, plucked from the air like birds, and placed inside the spiral's core. The vision blurred, twisted. Now he saw fire, the spiral glowing too bright, figures screaming, but no sound escaped. One statue crumbled, a figure collapsed, a warning, and then it ended. The chamber returned. The ring had risen again. He staggered back, sweating despite the cool air. What had he just seen? Historians still argue whether certain Sumerian myths referencing the language before breath were allegories or the remnants of an actual pre-verbal communication system, one that existed before language and required no sound at all. Some believed it to be divine. Others said it was a form of magic, so subtle it left no trace in history, only instinct. The alchemist now knew one thing for certain: the spiral was older than language, and far more dangerous than mere understanding. He touched one of the floor spirals between the statues. It lit up under his fingertips, forming a ring of light that pulsed once, then vanished. He tried another, same reaction. Each responded to his touch, each acknowledged presence, but only one, when pressed, made the floating ring move. A click, a spark. The metal ring twisted again, then lowered itself through the top of the dome. A deep, resonant pulse followed, felt only in the bones. The dome peeled open, and beneath it was not a stairwell or more stone. It was machinery, pipes, gears, spirals within spirals, but none of them turned until he stepped forward. Then, without touch, without command, they began to move. Gears clicked, tubes hissed, not with sound but pressure, memory, flow. The spiral mechanism had awoken, and at the center of it, embedded in a cradle of glass and bone, was a metallic heart. Not a real heart, not flesh, but shaped like one, or perhaps shaped like the idea of a heart, beating light within, silent, but unmistakably alive. He dared not touch it. Instead, he watched, waited. A small hatch opened at the front of the heart, revealing a hollow recess. It matched the size of the pendant he'd given to the spiral earlier, but it was gone now, which meant it had been absorbed, digested, prepared. The ring rose again from the machinery, glowing faintly, and etched a symbol into the air, the same one he had seen on the bone tablet, sacrifice. But then, beneath it, another glyph appeared. Return, the alchemist breathed out. It wasn't asking for more, it was offering something back. The memory he'd lost, his name, the silence he'd offered. It had been stored, saved, translated. The machinery wasn't a prison or a test. It was a library, a vault of unspoken things, and now it waited for him to decide. Would he take his name back, or descend deeper, unnamed and unreadable, into the next spiral? He closed his eyes, listened, and from the heart of the machinery, the silence answered, "Come further." The alchemist had always believed that silence could be useful, handy for focusing, for sneaking past the shrieking grocer's wife, for brewing the kinds of potions that hissed when you looked at them wrong. But never had he imagined silence as a kind of language, one that shaped machinery, shaped memory, shaped destiny. And now, standing at the edge of the spiral dome, watching the mechanical heart pulse quietly, he saw that silence was not an absence. It was a presence, and it was inviting him forward. A new doorway revealed itself, though not with hinges or handles. A circle of light simply appeared in the far wall, rippling like water just before a stone breaks its surface. The machinery slowed as he approached it, the gears ticking down not in sound but in rhythm, as if they knew he was going. He stepped through, and the world behind him fell away. No falling, no sensation of movement, just transition. One moment, the spiral chamber, the next, a vast open space that defied architecture. It looked like a chamber, but also like an amphitheater. Wide concentric rings made of polished black stone surrounded a central pit, empty and bottomless, and around its perimeter, positioned between columns that reached nowhere, stood statues once again. But these were different. They weren't robed. They weren't human, at least not anymore. The figures were twisted, stone forms that looked caught mid-movement, mouths wide open, arms raised in frozen protest, their bodies bent at odd angles, like dancers interrupted mid-leap. One had no head, another had 4 arms, all of them turned inward, as though staring into the pit at the center of the spiral's echo. The alchemist felt the pressure return, not weight, sound, or more precisely, the memory of sound, the ghosts of cries, screams, laughter, singing, all trapped, bound into the stone like insects in amber. It wasn't audible, but it pressed on his ribs, his lungs, the back of his eyes. His heart beat faster, not because he was afraid, but because this place remembered too much. And in the center of the pit, floating without anchor, hovered a single object, a tuning fork, 5 feet tall, made of something silvery that shifted hue when you tried to focus. Copper one moment, bone the next, wrapped in etchings that writhed like ink suspended in oil. He couldn't reach it. There was no path. So he waited, and then the whisper returned, clear and absolute. the choir of the forgotten. Historians still argue whether medieval choirs ever experimented with silent harmonics, synchronized breathing patterns meant to channel divine energy without a single note sung. One obscure manuscript even claimed a single monk, during a 38-day vow of silence, levitated an entire organ pipe with the force of his breath alone. Utter nonsense, probably. But now, the alchemist wasn't so sure, because he understood the figures around the pit had sung, and they had been silenced. Not by punishment, but by preservation. They had become echoes carved into stone, not as warnings, but as records. He stepped closer to one, a figure with hollow eyes and an open mouth, frozen in a scream. Up close, its surface shimmered, not like glass, like wax. He reached out, touched it, and was swallowed whole by memory. Not his own. He stood in a different time, a different place, the same chamber, but filled with living beings. Dozens of figures in robes standing in the concentric rings. Each inhaled, held their breath, and then exhaled in complete silence. No music, no word, just a coordinated wave of breath. The tuning fork vibrated, not with sound, with meaning. The spiral had reacted, and then something else had answered. He felt it, a presence in the dark, huge, watching, listening, but something had gone wrong. Someone had spoken. He didn't hear the word, but he felt the break, like glass cracking beneath velvet. A scream erupted, not from a mouth, but from the space between moments, and everything turned to stone. He blinked, returned to the chamber. The statue he had touched was cold again, still, the shimmer gone. He stepped back, shaken. Now he understood. The choir had not been destroyed. They had been preserved, locked in the moment of betrayal, and the spiral had remembered. A voice, his own, or perhaps the spiral's, said gently inside him, "Only in total silence can the next door open." He sat on the stone, breathing shallowly. The pressure of centuries pressed down. Total silence. Not just no sound, no thought, no memory, no past. He had already given up his name, now he would give up his story. And as he sat cross-legged, mind stilling, the chamber dimmed, the tuning fork pulsed, and slowly the spiral's echo began to unwind again. The alchemist closed his eyes. He no longer thought of himself as an alchemist. Truthfully, that word belonged to someone with a name, with a workshop, with a tea-stained robe, and a fondness for overcooked olives. He was none of those things now, just a presence, inhaling the dark. The choir of the forgotten loomed around him, still statues encircling the silent tuning fork. Their open mouths no longer frightened him. They mourned, perhaps, but they also warned. He breathed out slowly, letting go of the last memory still clinging to his mind, the smell of his herb shelf in the morning sun gone. He released it like smoke, and in that instant the tuning fork moved, just a twitch. But enough. Then came the scent, not one he expected, salt, and beneath it, ash. The air itself seemed to shift, not with wind, but with presence. It pressed against his skin like a warm hand testing the pulse in his neck. He opened his eyes. A crack had formed across the floor, slicing through the center of the chamber like a bolt of lightning drawn by hand. From it leaked a silvery vapor, slow-moving, thick as breath on a frozen mirror. The statues responded. One by one, they turned. No sound, no grinding stone, just the eerie, silent rotation of each figure now facing inward toward the alchemist. He did not run. Instead, he whispered into his own mind, "I'm still here." The vapor swirled around his ankles, and then the tuning fork struck. No noise, no vibration, just effect. His bones trembled. Not from impact, but resonance. Like every molecule in his body had been given a new rhythm and asked to dance. He looked toward the crack in the floor. It widened, blooming like a flower in slow motion. A second chamber yawned below, revealed not with grandeur, but with reluctance. It was darker than the rest, and drier. The scent of salt thickened, and underneath it all, a low, subtle odor of burning parchment and wet stone. A place where words had once lived and died. The alchemist stepped forward, down into the spiral's newest offering. The second chamber was rectangular, smaller, less adorned. The floor was packed earth, dry as powder. Along the walls stood 5 low shelves, each lined with what appeared to be ash-caked urns, cracked and scorched. In the center, an altar, or perhaps a table, laid across it, a scroll, burned at both ends, covered in symbols that shimmered as though they were ashamed to be read. He reached for it, but as his fingers grazed the edge, the chamber reacted. The walls turned dark, not black, empty, the kind of empty that eats light. The silence became a pressure, so intense he nearly choked on it. And then the ash on the urns moved. Not in the wind, there was no wind. It lifted upward, swirled together, and formed a single phrase across the altar in glowing, fading script. Speak, and it ages. He froze. That's when he noticed the rest of the room. The corners, once dim, now revealed. Things, a pair of boots, a cracked monocle, a satchel still clutching its seams, all of them aged beyond recognition, leathery, brittle, as if centuries had passed since they were dropped. But they hadn't decayed naturally. They had listened to something, and that something had heard them back. Historians still argue whether certain ancient scrolls could be cursed with language, texts that punished the act of reading them aloud. Most agree this was myth, meant to keep untrained scholars from opening dangerous tomes. But this room was different. It didn't punish reading, it punished sound itself, even unintentional sound. He stepped carefully, breath slow, pulse slower. He did not touch the scroll again, not yet. Instead, he observed a mirror fragment leaned against the corner. He picked it up, slowly, silently, and turned it toward the scroll. The reflection showed nothing. The scroll did not exist in the mirror. He checked the urns. Same result. Only the altar appeared. He frowned. He dipped his fingers into the ash. It hissed softly, dangerously, like time itself disliked being handled. He recoiled. The ash left a thin mark on his finger, not a burn, a wrinkle. He watched in alarm as the skin aged, just slightly, just enough to understand. The ash was not residue, it was memory. This chamber consumed sound and offered decay in return. A transaction. Speak, and time passes. Whisper, and decades pass. Shout. He didn't want to know. He sat cross-legged once more, the scroll before him, not touching, just thinking. The tuning fork had brought him here. The choir had turned to face him, and the spiral kept opening deeper, layer by layer, like a clock unfolding its own mechanisms. The room had one rule: silence is safety. But for what purpose? He thought of the urns, not containers of ash, but names, lives, maybe, people who spoke one word too many and were aged out of the world. He placed the mirror fragment on the altar, stepped back, and waited. The scroll shimmered, then unfolded of its own accord, and across its surface, one more phrase appeared, this one not written in symbols, but in a script he knew from dreams. To listen is to remember, to speak is to be forgotten. He stayed still for what felt like an hour, though it could have been days or only seconds. Time in this room didn't behave. It judged. The scroll had shifted again, unfolding along its burned edges, revealing faint illustrations that danced like light underwater. He knew better than to reach for it now. Even breathing too hard might cause a century to pass across his bones. He watched instead. The images moved slowly, a spiral, always a spiral, unwinding, not in the floor this time, but in the sky. A group of figures, faceless, gathered beneath it. Below them, a creature coiled in sleep, mouth open wide enough to swallow silence itself. Then came a final image, a figure standing before the spiral, arms spread, sound lines etched from their mouth like cracks through stone. The final panel, empty, just ash. He backed away from the altar. So far, he had sacrificed name, memory, sound, but this scroll, it warned of more, of awakening something, something beneath even this. As he turned to leave the room, the phrase returned in his mind, whispered not through his ears but into him, writ in ash and mercury. That phrase, it wasn't new. He had read it once, years ago in the margins of a dying man's travel journal, a former archivist who claimed to have touched a living spell. Words written in ash and mercury, The man had wheezed. Don't fade, they wait. At the time, the alchemist had assumed he was fevered. Now, he wasn't so sure. He needed more context. He needed the words of someone else who'd come this far. So, he climbed back up the spiral passage, carefully, quietly, back to the dome, the tuning fork, the choir, and there, resting where it hadn't been before, lay a small metal plate, thin, engraved, not left behind by time, left for him. He lifted it. The engraving read, "If you are reading this, you passed the ash test." He blinked. It continued, "My name was Tuvel, probably. It's hard to remember now. I made it to the chamber of memory and lived, barely. I'm leaving what I know here. You'll need it." Below it, a diagram, crude, etched by hand, a series of chambers, each marked by a symbol, spiral, dome, choir, ash, then a fifth, still unvisited, the cage. His breath caught. Tuvel, or whoever he had been, had made it one layer deeper. The plate went on. "There is a creature. It does not wake with sound. It wakes with thought. Keep your mind still. Keep your silence pure. Above all, do not bring words into the cage." The alchemist sat down, staring at the plate. The creature, the one depicted in the scroll, the one sleeping beneath the spiral. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't myth. It was next. Historians still argue whether alchemical texts should be interpreted literally or symbolically. Was the dragon in the crucible of the West an actual beast, or a metaphor for volatile compounds? Was the sleeping Leviathan an oceanic threat, or suppressed emotion? But down here, under floors and centuries, under ash and forgotten choirs, symbols became things. Words weren't just dangerous, they were alive. He climbed back to his home, or what had once been a home. It felt more like a cocoon now, just wood and habit wrapped around the spiral. The walls still whispered, quietly, comfortably. He took one last look at his journal, his tools, his nameplate, now blank. Then he fetched what he would need, a single flask of mercury, sealed in wax and bone, a shard of listening glass, used to reflect sounds into silence, and a vial containing the last dream he'd caught during an eclipse. He packed them gently, each item swaddled in cloth like relics of an older self. Before returning, he paused at the edge of the spiral. Ethel was waiting. She didn't move. She simply stared, and purred once, long and low. It was not approval, not warning, just remembrance. He whispered a thought to her, not out loud, but in that strange new space silence had carved open in him. "If I don't come back, bury the ink." She blinked, turned, and disappeared into the shadows. He stepped back into the spiral. The walls hummed, the dome opened, and beneath the chamber of ash, a new spiral turned, smaller, tighter, like the shell of a creature preparing to wake. The spiral tightened as he descended, coiling narrower with each step, as if the very air around him began folding in. This was no longer just a staircase. It was a funnel, a narrowing of space and self. The stone grew smoother, darker, less obedient to light. It didn't reflect his lantern glow. It simply absorbed it, drank it up like thirsting soil. The silence here felt heavier than anywhere above. It had weight, shape, even a taste. Then after 47 turns, yes, he counted, he stepped into a room that shimmered not with light, but with motion. Tiny things fluttered in the darkness. He froze. At first, he mistook them for dust motes, then for fireflies. Then he realized what they were, moths, but not ordinary ones. These were made of glass, thin, translucent wings gleamed with etched patterns like snowflakes or fractured runes. Their bodies were slim, mechanical, held together by brass hinges and coils finer than spider silk. They flew in silence, flitting between grooves in the wall that pulsed faintly as they passed. The alchemist dared a breath. The moths froze mid-air, then slowly resumed movement, each one in perfect coordination, like dancers returning to a synchronized ballet. He stepped forward. A low platform rose at the center of the room. Upon it floated an object, a key, not metaphorical, not symbolic, an actual, unmistakable key. And it too shimmered, not with polish, but with movement. its edges warped ever so slightly, as though its existence flickered between now and not now. Made of the same glassy brass material as the moths, it spun gently in the air without strings or support. He did not reach for it. Instead, he watched the moths. One landed on his shoulder, its wings tickled like breath against skin. He resisted the urge to flinch. Its tiny mechanical head rotated once, then it lifted off and rejoined the swarm. Then the key stopped spinning, and he heard it. Not a sound, no, an instruction. Breathe evenly, one thought, one silence. The alchemist did as he was told. Inhale, hold, exhale, stillness. And in that moment of complete mental stillness, the key descended, lowering itself into his open palm. It was lighter than he expected, and warm, like it had waited for him. Historians still argue whether automaton insects, especially in pre-modern Asia, ever truly existed, or were products of courtly imagination. Some manuscripts describe dual-winged locusts that could spy and return. Others whisper of the clockwork fire beetles made by monks who forgot how to speak. Most dismiss them as fable, but this room had built them, or summoned them, because the moths weren't just guardians, they were listeners. One fluttered past his ear. On its wings he now noticed tiny script, etched so small that even his best lenses would have failed to read it, but he felt the meaning as it brushed past. We record what you forget, he understood then. This chamber wasn't protected from intruders, it was protected from memory. Those who reached this far were meant to forget what they'd seen, and the moths ensured it. Each wing beat brushed clean a little more of the past. He tightened his grip on the key. It pulsed gently in his palm, a silent rhythm only he could hear. The room shimmered again, and this time the far wall opened. Not like a door, it didn't swing or slide, it simply ceased to be. Behind it, a corridor of spiraled glass led downward. The walls moved as he walked, shifting color and transparency, reflecting his silhouette back at him in distorted fragments. In one pane, he saw himself as a child, in another as an old man, in a third as a flame. The key vibrated gently, the corridor darkened, and then he was at the threshold of the next chamber, smaller, darker. A lock sat embedded in a black stone pedestal, smooth and seamless, with only one feature, a slot shaped exactly like the key. But surrounding the pedestal were words, carved in spirals, readable only by walking. So he did. He circled the pedestal, eyes tracking each twist of script. Only those who forget themselves may enter. Only those who forgive themselves may pass. Only those who remember nothing but silence may survive. He completed the circle, stared down at the key, and understood. This wasn't the key to unlock a door. This was the key to unlock consequence. Once inserted, there would be no turning back. The spiral would continue. His memory would not, and yet he felt no hesitation, because something deeper than curiosity had taken root, a need to understand, not just the mechanism, but the purpose. He placed the key in the slot. It clicked, and the world breathed in. The breath in, the world's breath, not his own, didn't end. It simply held, a long, still inhalation that made the air feel dense, as if the room itself was waiting to exhale, only if he proved worthy. The key shimmered once, and then melted, not with heat, with purpose. It dissolved into the pedestal like ink into thirsty paper, and with it, the final outline of the room faded away. What remained was not darkness, nor light, but mirror. He stood, suddenly, in a perfect replica of his study, not as it was now, but as it had once been before the floor broke, before the spiral was revealed. The table still bore the burn mark from the pine resin experiment. Ethel's perch by the window remained, except Ethel herself was not there. Every detail was precise, and yet subtly wrong. The silence here was different, not thick, not threatening, but absolute. His own breath, still moving, no longer registered in his ears. He clapped once, instinctively, no sound. His body moved, the world did not respond. He turned toward the stairwell leading to the second floor, and found himself standing at the top. Another version, a mirror self, same robes, same unbrushed hair, same wayward eyebrow that had never once behaved. But this version didn't move. It watched, not cruelly, not even curiously, just with recognition. And then it turned and walked away. Not out of fear, out of invitation. He followed. Through the copy of his home, now strangely distorted, doorways that didn't quite lead where they should, windows opening to unfamiliar gardens. The sky outside, silver and still. This was not a dream. Dreams had logic. This was a reflection. The other him, he began thinking of it as the mirror self, led him into the back room. It was where he'd once stored dried herbs and forgotten scrolls. But here, it was a garden. Impossible, underground. Yet flowers bloomed. Trees curved upward into a sky that could not be, and none of it made a sound. The plants moved, but only when not looked at. The moment his gaze landed, they stilled, perfectly frozen in mid-twist, mid-blossom, mid-exhale. He blinked, and the shapes changed again. Fringe naturalist reports from centuries past mention silent gardens buried in the caverns of forgotten continents, gardens where plants moved only when unobserved, grown from seeds stolen from gods. Most dismissed these tales as allegorical. The alchemist now knew otherwise. He reached toward a branch bearing bell-shaped flowers. His fingers brushed the petals, and immediately he felt a word. Not in his mind, not in his body, but in the garden itself. It didn't speak, it impressed. Listen, and just like that, 1,000 things came alive, not aloud, but in awareness. The trees held memories. Each leaf shimmered with forgotten moments. A vine twined up a stone, glowing softly with the scent of crushed ink. A bush curled around a statue, a copy of him again, this time frozen in a thoughtful pose, finger to lips. His mirror self appeared again, standing on a bridge made of petrified breath. Don't ask how he knew. It was just a sense and beckoned him forward. He crossed. In the center of the garden was a pool, still, black, not reflecting the sky. It reflected silence, not image, not form. The moment he looked into it, he saw not his face, but feeling, all the quiet moments he'd ever experienced. The first time he'd realized no one was coming to help. The quiet of watching someone leave and not stopping them. The stillness after his first successful brew. No applause, just internal awe. These were the waters of unspoken memory. And then he saw her. His mirror self stood beside someone. A woman. Her form shimmered, but he knew her. Though he couldn't name her. A voice, once important, now forgotten. She reached toward him, not across the pool, but into him. And again, a word formed from thought, not sound. You are what remains when the noise is gone. Historians still argue whether there were ever mirror dimensions theorized in alchemical circles. Some texts mention realms of reflection, where selves not chosen lived out shadow lives. One particularly obscure fragment describes the spiral world, a reality governed not by causality, but by quiet. He was in it now, and the garden pulsed, not like a heart, but like an inhale. He turned back toward the pool. His mirror self was gone. In its place stood a pedestal. On it, a single object, a mask, not decorative, not ceremonial, just simple, pale, featureless. It pulsed once, and a whisper unfolded. Where this and all selves fall away, only silence remains. He lifted it. It was light, cool, and when he placed it against his face, the garden vanished. There was no transition this time, no swirl of darkness, no gentle descent, no pull or push or spatial unraveling. One moment, the mask touched his face. The next, he stood somewhere else entirely, somewhere far older than thought, older even than silence. He no longer wore his robes, or felt his body. He was a shape, a breath of consciousness with form only when needed. The mask hadn't just covered his face, it had removed it, along with identity, name, even weight. He felt like the idea of a man, abstracted, smoothed. The world around him was still and vast. A white plain stretched in every direction, blank but not empty. It buzzed faintly, not in sound but in sensation. Beneath it, just below the surface, something curled, something alive. Before him stood a figure. It was him, but not the mirror self from before. This one was older, robes flowing in ways that robes shouldn't flow, like water held in shape by memory. Its eyes were closed, no breath, no heartbeat, but fully aware, they faced one another in a silence, so complete that even thought felt like shouting. The other him raised a hand, and a garden grew, instantly, explosively, all around them. Flowers, vines, and curling branches burst from the white, shaping structures of vibrant green and impossible geometry. The blooms spun like wheels, trees had no bark, only layers of etched crystal, and the sky, once white, filled with hues that didn't exist in language. The garden of unspoken names had returned. This version was different, deeper. Here, plants moved when watched. A vine twisted toward him, only when he looked at it. A cluster of roses bloomed wider, the more he focused. A great flowering tree near the center folded into itself, the moment he blinked. Here, observation was interaction, and every movement he made left behind a ripple of echo, not of sound but of awareness. He stepped carefully, the other him followed. They did not speak, they didn't need to. Thoughts passed like wind between two mirrors facing inward. He learned the truth. This world was built long ago, not by alchemists but by keepers, people or beings who understood that sound was volatile, that language shaped reality, that speaking something out loud gave it structure and therefore risked unleashing it. So they created a vault, a spiral buried beneath stone and memory and time, a mechanism not for hiding but for holding. It collected sound, collected names, and once a name was held it could not be spoken again. He looked down at his hands. They were solid now, gloved, familiar. His body had returned, so had the weight of breath. The other him, now clearly the keeper, turned and pointed toward a stone arch at the edge of the impossible garden. Beyond it, a wall. On that wall, thousands of glyphs, carved with perfect care. He stepped forward. Each glyph shimmered faintly with a name. Some names he felt were places, others were people. Some were just feelings, but all of them were unspoken, until one stopped him cold. It glowed faintly, and it was his, not the name he'd used in the town, not Alchemist. His true name, the one his mother had whispered once before letting go, the one he hadn't said aloud in decades, and beside it, another, the same name, written again, but scratched out. Historians still argue whether names held metaphysical power in ancient cultures, or whether it was all symbolic. But in this world, names were weights, and erasing one, that was sacrifice. He looked to the keeper, understanding passed between them. He had passed all the trials. He had listened. He had forgotten. And now, he was ready to claim the spiral's final knowledge. A choice. The keeper raised both hands. In one a glowing orb, bright, like the spiral's heart, pulsing with preserved memory. In the other, a flat, obsidian coin, dull, silent, warm, with forgetting, to remember, or to become. He stood there a long time, long enough for the garden to shift around him 3 times. Then he reached forward, and touched the orb. It sank into his palm, and the world collapsed, gently, not into noise, into understanding. He did not fall. He descended, slowly, like paper through water. The world collapsed inward and remade itself, not in architecture or sound, but in meaning. Images passed by, but not as memories, more like a scroll being rapidly turned by an unseen hand, symbols flickering too quickly to grasp, and then it stopped. He stood, once again solid, clothed, breathing, in a place that felt like a city, but sounded like nothing, not even air. The buildings were made of bone, actual bone, towering vertebrae and rib cages, sculpted into arches, balconies, domes. The windows were hollow sockets. The roads were paved with flattened knuckle bones and polished femurs. Everything curved inward around a central tower, tall, spindled, wrapped in spiral carvings, so intricate they shimmered like water under moonlight. No smoke, no wind, no people, yet he felt them watching. The bells of Bone Harbor, that's what came to him, not a name spoken but impressed into his thoughts by the spiral itself. This was the place he'd glimpsed in the scroll, the city the others had failed to reach. The city that had given up sound entirely. He moved cautiously through its streets, and the bones beneath his feet did not echo. His own breathing was dampened as if wrapped in cloth. And yet, high above, wind chimes spun in the still air, bone chimes. They didn't tinkle or clang, they didn't make sound at all, but when he passed beneath them, one rang, a deep, subtle pulse, not in his ears, but in his chest. Someone had died. That was the function of the bells. They didn't ring when people made noise. They rang when someone silently passed away. Each tower's bell had a frequency, not of pitch, but of intent. A farewell tuned to the soul of the departed. A chill slid down his spine, because one had just rung for him. He turned quickly. A figure stood at the edge of the road, tall, robed, and fully silent. It wore a mask like his, but unlike his, it was fused to the face. No gaps, no seams, just skin and mask become one. It didn't approach, just stood, waiting, and then more appeared. 2, 5, 9, all around the city square, each one masked, each one still, not hostile, not welcoming, just aware. He stepped forward, and they parted without sound. Beyond them, a set of stairs descended into the tower, the final place, a library, a vault, a tomb. He couldn't be sure. Historians still argue whether certain cities of silence, like the rumored necropolis of Sufalun, actually existed. Described in scattered parchments and discredited manuscripts, these cities were said to be ruled by silence itself, where any sound would awaken the dead. Most scholars dismiss these tales as religious metaphors, but Bone Harbor was real. He entered the tower. The air thickened, not with dust, but with thought. The walls pulsed faintly with impressions, moments, feelings, flashes of entire lives passed in stillness. Every step he took was like stepping through the outer layer of someone else's dream. At the center of the tower, a single pedestal, and upon it, a bell, black, seamless, engraved with spirals. Its surface shimmered as if trying to remain unseen. The masked figures stood around him in a wide ring. He now understood. Each of them had once worn the mask as he did. Each of them had reached this place. But unlike him, they had chosen silence forever, and the bell, that was the price. If he rang it, even once, just one touch, it would awaken the city, not into chaos, but into remembrance. He'd return his sound to the world, his name, his voice, his self, but the city would fall. Bone Harbor was built to contain something, perhaps not a creature, perhaps not even danger, but sound itself. If he rang the bell, he would leave with everything he had learned, but silence would never be the same again. The masked figures did not move, they did not urge him forward, they simply watched, waiting to see who he would become. He looked down at his hands, remembered the silence beneath the floorboards, the spiral that pulsed only when he listened, the moths that guarded memory, the dream garden of reflection, the choir who had turned, wordless, the echo of a voice that said, "You are not alone." And then, the whisper returned, "To remember fully is to reshape the world." He stepped toward the bell, lifted a hand, paused, not out of fear, out of reverence. Then, he turned away, and the masked figures bowed their heads, in silent approval. He would not take the spiral's power back into noise, not yet. He would descend again, deeper, until silence was not a condition, but a language. The descent this time was different. It didn't involve stairs or passageways or illusions of space. It was like folding into a breath, held by something ancient. The alchemist, if he could still be called that, passed downward in the same way a thought passes from the edge of consciousness into a dream, effortlessly and without permission. He emerged in a chamber with no floor, no ceiling, just a surface of glowing dust suspended in still air, like someone had frozen a sandstorm mid-motion. Above him, nothing. Below him, less. And at the center of it all, floating like a drop of ink in oil, a cauldron, not the kind for brewing. This one was a vessel. It was cracked along one side, its rim scorched, its surface covered in symbols that looked unfinished, or perhaps in progress. They shifted, not in shape, but in interpretation. He looked once and saw spirals, blinked and saw flame, looked again, and they became numbers. He stepped forward, though there was no ground. His foot found footing only when he intended it. That was the rule here. Only conscious movement had consequence. Unconscious motion, breathing, blinking, did nothing, but step without thought, and you'd fall into nothing. At the edge of the cauldron, the world rippled, and then came the voice. Not spoken, not impressed, not even whisper. It was shared, like a memory rising that had never been yours. You have come far. He bowed his head, whether out of reverence or exhaustion he couldn't say. This is the brewing place, the place where silence is distilled, and now he could see them. Figures, shadows of people, moving along the swirling dust, each carrying flasks, scrolls, fragments of words. They walked without faces, without edges, and when they reached the cauldron, they poured in their burdens. Each offering caused the liquid inside, if it was liquid, to shimmer and pulse with patterns of light. The alchemist stepped closer. Inside the cauldron was not water or mercury. It was thought, slick, glimmering, alive, and at the center of it floated a single vial, stoppered, sealed. Inside it, a fluid so still it might have been solid. Its glow was barely perceptible, like watching someone breathe while pretending not to. He understood immediately. This was the last vow. Not the final word, but the final intention. Historians still argue whether early vows of silence were spiritual, medical, or disciplinary in nature. Monasteries, certain temples, and even obscure guilds used silence to train the mind or punish the body. But here, at the base of the spiral, it was none of those. Silence was not an absence. It was an ingredient. The last vow wasn't a vow of silence. It was silence made substance. He reached for the vial, and the cauldron spoke again. What will you offer? He thought he'd already given everything. His name, his voice, his identity. But the cauldron wasn't asking for those. It was asking for one perfect moment. The spiral didn't want endless stillness. It wanted distillation, the purest drop. The alchemist closed his eyes. He thought back. What was the moment that had taught him silence? Not in sound. In truth, he found it. A boy, long ago, coughing, feverish, too far gone, and he, young, eager, arrogant, had brewed the wrong tonic. Too much wormroot, not enough fever vine. The boy had looked at him and said nothing, not because he couldn't speak, but because he chose not to, not with anger, not with fear, just acceptance. That moment had never left him. He had buried it under formulas, forgotten it beneath lectures and late-night brews, but it had lived. The cauldron shimmered, the dust around the chamber spiraled inward, and the vial pulsed. Once, he stepped forward and placed his palm just above it. The vial rose, waited. He picked it up. It was warm, and very, very quiet. The shadows around him bowed. He was no longer merely a visitor to the spiral. He was now its brewer. The silence it collected, it would now flow through him. He tucked the vial into the folds of his robe. The chamber dimmed, and a new path opened. Spiraling not downward this time, but inward, he would carry the last vow. But what it did, he had yet to discover. Only one truth was certain now. The silence was watching, and it was ready for the next word. The spiral no longer spiraled. It unfurled. No longer a path that turned inward or downward, but now an open road, straight and still, stretching through what looked like memory given structure. The alchemist walked without wind, without gravity, across a corridor made of gently pulsing light. Beneath him, moments flickered, a candle being blown out, lips closing before a confession, a newborn's first blink. Each footstep brought him closer to the core, not of the spiral's design, but of its reason. He carried the vial now, the last vow, and though it was small, it grew heavier by the moment, not in weight, in significance. It pulsed once every 27 steps, always 27, and with each pulse, a memory slipped free from the back of his mind. He did not fight it. A formula forgotten, a friend he failed, a lullaby he had once made up for no one in particular. These were offerings now, leaking not in pain but in purpose. A head, a gate, it was not built. It had formed, a great archway of silent materials, columns made of compressed thought. its keystone etched with a spiral so tight it appeared as a point. He stepped through without hesitation. The room within was not a room, it was a void with shape. And at the center, floating and waiting, was the creature, or at least the shape of it. It had no limbs, no mouth, only listening. Its body was a mass of folds and spirals, a fluid sculpture of senses attuned to only what was not spoken. It pulsed slightly, as if in tune with a sound not yet made. The alchemist understood immediately. This was what lay at the heart of the spiral. Not a monster, not a god, not even a guardian, but a vessel of silence itself. It watched him with no eyes. He bowed, not out of worship, but recognition. And it spoke, not in sound, not in mind, but in emotion. I am the last listener. The alchemist remained still. The creature's presence expanded, not physically, emotionally. Memories he didn't know he had surfaced. Tiny, brittle things. The texture of his mother's shawl, the bitter taste of over-steeped chamomile, the shape of his hands when he first held fire in a flask. Then the creature curled inward. It pulsed again, and then asked, not in voice, but in pressure, "Why have you come?" And for the first time since the spiral had opened, he answered, still without sound. He opened his robe, held out the vial, the last vow. The creature drew closer, not with hunger, with caution. It floated there, inches from the vial, and time seemed to pause. Historians still argue whether emotion can be communicated without language, whether art, gesture, or expression can truly translate intent. The spiral didn't care. It had always known that silence held more truth than words, that silence could be shaped, distilled, and finally offered. The creature reached for the vial, but not with limbs, with resonance. The spiral in its body pulsed, and the vial began to vibrate in his hand. Then, at once, they touched, the creature and the vow, and it shuddered, not violently, reverently. The room, or whatever this space was, dimmed further, and a ripple spread outward, curling along the walls like wind made visible. Not a shock wave, a thought wave. Every surface shimmered, and then the alchemist was inside the creature, not consumed, joined. He saw it now, the memories it held, the others who had come before, the four. One had wept aloud, gone in a second. One had tried to speak the creature's name, and aged into dust. One had refused to listen, and vanished before even reaching this chamber. And the last had done what he had just done, given the last vow, and in doing so become part of the spiral. The creature curled tightly now, like a child tucking into sleep, and for the first time, the alchemist heard something, a whisper, from the very center of the silence. Now, you may ask. He felt the question rising, not with his voice, with his being, and so he asked, "What are you?" The creature pulsed once, twice, and then, "I am the breath between creation and understanding. I am the pause that makes meaning." He nodded, and understood. He had brewed the final potion, and in doing so created the final silence. He turned to leave, and the path appeared before him again, not spiraled, but straight, leading home. He returned through the straight path, not as the same man who had entered it, nor as the one who had broken through the floorboards of his workshop. He was still him, but now quieter in ways no voice could restore. The vial was gone, not discarded, not lost, given. The creature, the last listener, had absorbed it, not as a drink or a relic, but as a story, and in return, it had granted him a question. One question, answered not in riddles or prophecy, but in clarity, and that clarity clung to him now. Back in the spiral corridor, things were different. The light shimmered less aggressively. The walls no longer tested each step. The moths, when he passed them again, fluttered without retreating. One even landed gently on his shoulder, and remained, glowing faintly, as if he were now part of the chamber's silence. But most telling of all was the spiral itself. It had changed, or rather, it had opened. Where once there had been resistance, rings that required offerings, breathlessness, suppression, now there was only quiet understanding. The rings still turned, the glyphs still flowed like ink through silk, but now they did so with him, not in reaction, in cooperation. He stepped once more into the dome chamber, where the tuning fork still hovered, but lower now, no longer waiting for song. It pulsed in the rhythm of his heartbeat, which now moved more slowly than it ever had before. He thought he might finally be allowed rest, but the spiral wasn't done. Beneath the dome, another scene widened, and from within, a creature emerged. Not the listener, not a ghost or an echo, but something else entirely. It was small, shimmering, like a wisp made of calligraphy and breath. It looked almost like a person, but with no edges, no features. It hovered in the space like a note not yet played. And then it felt, not spoke. Felt. You called me with silence. He blinked. It wasn't the voice of the listener. It wasn't even a singular identity. This was the spiral itself, the thing beneath his house, the thing within his house. He had been walking across its skin this whole time, and now it had awakened. "Who are you?" he asked. With no sound, the part of you that knew not to speak, the part of the world that knew to listen. It approached, hovering a breath away from his face. You gave your name, then your voice, then your question. You passed your silence into the vessel. Now, it reached forward, though it had no hands. "I return a part of myself," and with that, it entered him, not with pain, with peace. He did not change shape or feel any jolt. He just knew more, felt more. Silence no longer seemed like emptiness. It had structure, rooms, branches, spirals, and within each memory, feeling, language without tongue or ink. The spiral had been a place, yes, but now it was part of him. He saw in his mind 1,000 other spirals buried in forgotten homes, quiet libraries, deserts where no one walked anymore, each one with a listener, each one waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to stop talking and hear. And more than anything, he now understood that the spiral had not asked for a name or a vow or a voice because it wanted obedience. It had asked for them because those were the locks, and he had been the key. He stepped out of the dome chamber, and the machinery did not groan. It hummed softly, like a mother soothing a sleepless child. Back in his workshop, the real one now returned. He stood among the old scrolls, the scattered herbs, the long-forgotten cups of ink, everything as he'd left it. But he was not as he had been. He looked down, and saw the spiral still there beneath the boards. But it didn't glow anymore. It didn't need to. It was listening. And now, so was he. He didn't speak for days. Not because he couldn't. His voice, though long dormant, returned as easily as breath. But because he now understood how heavy words were, how each one settled into the world like a stone dropped into water. Ripples didn't always stop. Some kept moving, some echoed. So he watched instead. He listened. And the spiral, no longer hidden beneath planks, but carefully ringed with worn rugs and small silver glyphs, listened back. It was never entirely still now. Even without light, without movement, the lines along its etched rings shimmered faintly at night, forming shapes that lasted just long enough to suggest something meaningful, and then disappeared. They weren't trying to communicate. They were simply being. He spent his days archiving silence, which of course sounded ridiculous at first. But the longer he observed, the more he realized there were types. The silence of rain approaching, the silence of a decision just before it's made, the silence between two people who understand. He created jars for each glass vials corked not with wood, but with old breath, sealed by intention. Inside he kept fragments, an old feather, a memory-etched coin, a curl of bark from the garden of unspoken names. Each one held a resonance. When opened, they didn't say anything. They reminded. He no longer wrote words in his journal, just spirals. Each spiral had slight variations. One coiled tightly, denoting stillness. One unfurled halfway movement. One looped inward, then abruptly reversed. Hesitation. A new language was forming. Not of syntax or speech, but of presence. He kept the spiral's teachings hidden, not out of secrecy, but because the spiral had never asked to be shared. It had only asked to be understood. Still, on rare days he would wander through the nearby town. People knew him, of course. They always had. But now they greeted him with gentler tones, unsure if he still heard them the same way. Some joked that he'd lost his marbles in a flask. Others whispered he'd found something sacred. He just smiled. He noticed how few people listened when others spoke. He noticed how often people filled space with noise. And he noticed how rarely anyone asked a question that wasn't just a placeholder for their next statement. One evening, a child approached him in the square, tugging gently at the edge of his sleeve. "Are you the man with the glowing floor?" He nodded. The child hesitated, then said, "My brother died last year." He didn't say goodbye. He knelt, reached into his satchel, removed a tiny jar with nothing inside, just a thread of gold ink on the glass, swirling in the shape of a spiral. "This is silence," he said quietly. "That means remembering without needing words." He handed it over. The child took it with the solemnity only children can muster. He watched her walk away, and for the briefest moment, the spiral beneath his home glowed again. That night, he sat beside it, notebook in lap, and began to record something new, the spiral's final language. It was not a glossary, it was not a cipher, it was a feeling mapped across symbols, how it felt to lose, how it felt to remember, how it felt to sit beside a friend and say nothing at all, because no word could improve the moment. Each glyph he sketched shimmered faintly after he drew it, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. Historians still argue whether early pictographic systems were based on literal objects or emotional associations. The spiral's language didn't care. It didn't capture nouns or verbs. It captured experience. He wrote through the night, and when the candle burned low, he let the silence speak the rest. He no longer dreamed the way he used to. Before the spiral opened, his dreams had been erratic, flickers of alchemical recipes gone wrong, faces he couldn't name, old mistakes dressed in new robes. But now, his dreams were slow, measured, often soundless. Sometimes they were only colors, or spirals turning across vast fields of grey. One night, he dreamed of the listener again, not in its true form, but as a shape made of velvet shadow and breathless warmth. It didn't speak. It simply sat across from him at a table with no surface, in a room with no corners. Between them hovered the vial, the last vow, full again. He awoke before the dream could end. When he stepped into his workshop, he saw that something had changed. The spiral was glowing, not pulsing, not flaring, glowing. A quiet, steady light that warmed the floor around it, like moonlight resting on still water. And at its center, where once there had been the keyhole and the endless descent, there now stood a locket. No hinge, no clasp, just a round, flat coin with a thin chain, resting perfectly still. He approached carefully, his breath caught. The spiral knew what this was, and so did he. It wasn't a relic, it was a vessel. He picked it up. It was warm, and as soon as his fingers closed around it, the spiral whispered in that now familiar way, impression over sound, sensation over language. This binds the listener's breath. It opens only when the wearer is truly understood. That last part echoed, deeper than it should have. He turned the locket over. On the back, a spiral carved so finely, it looked like a hairline crack in the metal, but it pulsed faintly, as if syncing to his pulse. He sat down, locket in hand, unsure whether to feel reverence or fear, a locket that could only be opened when someone felt fully understood. He imagined trying to explain that to someone, not just understood intellectually, but emotionally, felt known, completely, impossible almost. Which was perhaps the point. The spiral didn't want to be opened by arrogance or calculation or tricks. It wanted to be opened by presence. He considered what that meant. Could he give this to someone? Would it open if a dying man finally forgave himself? Would it open if a lonely woman looked at her child and knew, truly knew, that they were not alone? And if it did open, what would it release? A piece of the listener, the last vow, or something else entirely? He didn't know, and he wasn't meant to. This wasn't a tool, it was a test. A spiral that had learned to bind itself into a single object, light enough to carry, heavy enough to change everything. He wrapped it gently in silk, placed it in a small wooden box, and carved a single glyph into the lid, the symbol for pause. Then he buried it. Not deep, just enough. Just under the floorboards, right beside the spiral's center, where the old rug used to be, where it had all started. He patted the boards back into place, brushed the dust from his hands, and sat, not to meditate, not to think, just to be still. The spiral dimmed again, fading to a soft silver glow, no longer calling. No longer asking, just being. He smiled. Not everything needed to be discovered now. Some truths deserved to be waited for. The house was quiet now, not just in sound but in rhythm. It breathed differently, slow, like a sleeping animal. The spiral beneath the floorboards no longer shifted unless it had a reason to, and the alchemist had stopped trying to provoke it. Whatever it had to teach him had already taken root, curled gently through his mind like ivy on old stone. He didn't brew much anymore, not in the old way. He still kept his shelves stocked, of course, out of habit, and for the occasional feverish visitor or lovesick apprentice. But his real work had changed. Now he brewed pauses, a balm made of stillness for those too tired to speak, an ink that wrote only the words you wished you'd said, a tea that lets silence linger between two people without the pressure to fill it. He never sold these things. He gave them freely to those who needed them and knew how to ask without asking. Sometimes, travelers would arrive, quiet ones. They'd heard of the spiral, they said, or of the man who no longer spoke, unless it was worth the air. Most were skeptics. Some were seekers. A rare few were ready. He would let them sit beside the floorboards. He would not explain. If the spiral responded, it was between them and it. He simply sat nearby, watching the shadows move across the walls, measuring silence not in absence but in texture. One day, a woman arrived. She carried nothing, wore no shoes, said nothing. She simply sat beside the spiral for 3 days straight. He brought her food, which she did not eat. He brought her water, which she accepted only on the 3rd night. She did not move, did not sleep. On the morning of the 4th day, the spiral pulsed once, just once, and then returned to stillness. She smiled, bowed her head, and left. He never asked what it had shown her. That wasn't how this worked. Historians still argue whether real power ever came from silence, or whether it was always just a metaphor for submission. But that debate missed the point. The spiral hadn't asked anyone to be obedient. It had asked them to stop interrupting, to sit long enough to actually hear what was already waiting. He often stood by the window now, watching the seasons shift in the garden. The wind still hummed through the chimney, and mice still argued in the walls. But inside himself, he held stillness like a second heart. Sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, when the fog had just begun to lift from the fields, he could feel the spiral shifting beneath him, not physically, spiritually. It would stretch gently, testing the air, the moment, the world. Then it would settle again. He knew it was listening, and it knew he was too. He had not mastered it. He had not solved it. He had become its keeper, and the locket, still buried beneath the floorboards, waited for someone who truly needed it. Someone who could open it, not with sound, but with being. The spiral would know when they arrived. Until then, the alchemist, no longer needing to be called anything at all, tended his quiet house, in his quiet town, at the edge of a world that talked too much, and below him, in the spiral's hush, something beautiful kept breathing. And now, here we are, near the edge of this quiet little tale. You've walked beside the spiral, felt its soft pull, its silence unfolding in gentle turns. Maybe you're still wondering what was real, what was metaphor, and whether the spiral was ever truly alive. Or maybe you already know the answer, because the spiral was never about the alchemist. Not really. It was about what happens when we finally stop reaching, stop naming, stop trying to control everything that might open or close inside us. It was about silence. The kind that doesn't ask for anything in return, the kind that lets us rest. So if you're lying there, wrapped in a blanket or curled up on your side, with your thoughts slowing just a bit, notice that quiet, that hush, that space between words where your mind starts to drift. It's a good space to be in. You don't need to do anything with it, just allow it. And if, by chance, something in this story stirred something quiet in you, a pause, a memory, a breath you didn't know you were holding, then maybe you found your own spiral tonight. Let it stay with you, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a place to return to whenever the world gets too loud. So now, Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let your thoughts slow down like leaves settling on water, and trust that, beneath it all, something is listening, not waiting for noise, just listening. Good night.